Today I would like to explain about terms of payment for foreign trade. When doing business with companies abroad, it is not always possible to use the terms of payment customary in domestic trade. This is because the seller needs to have more control over payment. If Company A in England sells goods to Company B in the same country, it is relatively easy to recover the debt if Company B doesn't pay. Company A just sends 3 reminders to Company B, and if this doesn't work, they can start legal proceedings. However, if Company A exports goods to Company C in China, for example, and Company C doesn't pay, this way of recovering the debt isn't practical. Therefore, Company A has to make sure that the Chinese company only gets the goods if they pay in China. In order to do this, both companies work in close collaboration with their banks and carriers. The 3 terms of payment commonly used in foreign trade are cash against document or CAD, 2 documents against acceptance DA, 3 letter of credit. Cash against documents or CAD. This term of payment is also known as documents against payment or DP. The buyer needs the transport documents before he can take possession of the goods he has purchased, but is only given them after paying a side bill drawn by the seller. A CAD payment transaction is effected as follows. 1. The seller sends the goods to the carrier, ship owner, airline, etc. Number 2. The carrier gives the necessary transport documents to the seller and transport the goods to the buyer's country. And then the step 3, the seller collects any other transport documents which may be necessary and gives them to his bank or the remitting bank together with a side draft. Step 4, the remitting bank sends the transport documents and the draft to the buyer banks or the collecting bank. The buyer is notified when they arrive. The next step, the buyer pays the side bill and receives the transport documents in return. He can then take the transport documents to collect his goods from the carrier in his country. And then the 6th or the last step, the collecting bank sends the payment to the remitting bank. The amount is credited to the seller. This means that if the buyer doesn't pay, he doesn't get the goods. This minimizes the risk of the seller, because if the buyer doesn't pay, the seller can ask the collecting bank to find another buyer. In theory, this minimizes the loss for the seller, but may be a problem if he is exporting perishable goods, for example. CAD holds a certain risk for the buyer because he doesn't have the chance to examine the goods before he has paid for them. However, this risk can be minimized by asking the seller to arrange examination of the goods by an inspection company before they are dispatched. The inspection company will then seal the goods and issue an inspection certificate, which has to be sent to the collecting bank with the transport documents and the site draft. Documents against acceptance, or DA. This term of payment is very similar to CAD. However, instead of sending a site draft to his bank, the seller sends a time draft in order to get the transport documents. The buyer only has to accept the draft. A maturity, he goes back to his bank and pays for the goods. A DA transaction is therefore effected as follows. First, the seller sends the goods to the carrier. Second, or the next step, the carrier gives the necessary shipping documents to the seller and transport the goods to the buyer's country. The third step, the seller collects the other shipping documents and gives them to his bank, the remittent banks, together with a time draft. The next step, the remitting bank sends documents and draft to the collecting bank or the buyer's bank. The buyer is notified too when they arrive. The next step, the buyer goes to his bank and accepts the time draft. In return, he is given the transport documents and can collect his goods. And the last step, at maturity, the buyer goes back to his bank and pays the bill of exchange. The money is sent from the collecting bank, the remitting bank, and credited to the seller account. Obviously, this is more preferable for the buyer than CAD, as he can take possession of the goods before paying. However, DA carries a considerable risk for the seller. If the buyer fails to honor the bill of exchange, the seller probably won't be able to recover the goods. This means 2 or 3 months may elapse between the time the draft is accepted and the time it matures.